Now, there have been a range of explanations offered for why African Americans have fared and continue to fare so much worse across so many dimensions. And many of those explanations are rooted in what has come to be called the culture of poverty thesis. And this chart from a professor at Stanford, I think, nicely captures many of the key elements of that, and it's worth pausing and maybe glancing through it. In brief, what it tells us is that it roots this notion of a culture of poverty, roots poverty, especially concentrated poverty among African Americans, in the behavior of individuals, families, and even entire communities. It places ignorance and immorality as the source of need. I want to offer a different kind of explanation, and one that sociologists would call structural rather than behavioral. And to do that, I want to first return us to the long history of the U.S. welfare state that many of you will find familiar from your Policy 1 course. So think about what you know about the Progressive Era, for example. The widespread reforms of that period, which are arguably the first foundation of the welfare state, at least at the state level, are largely innovations of large cities of the North. The Progressive Era tends to be told as a history of Chicago, of New York, of Philadelphia, of Boston, and so on. But precisely because some 90% of African Americans lived in the South as late as 1900, and almost 80% of them were still there by 1940, these are inescapably histories of white natives and white ethnic immigrants from Europe. Now, as we move forward in time, even those programs of the national government, once it began to create its own broad-based social welfare programs, were often explicitly structured in order to exclude blacks, notably Social Security's old age pension, unemployment insurance, and ADC provisions. After the war, the GI Bill, structured to accommodate Jim Crow, routinely denied benefits to black servicemen. And the Federal Housing Administration, the Home Ownership Loan Corporation, built discriminatory housing practices right into their policies. This is what historian Ira Katznelson refers to as the period when affirmative action was white. Starting in the 1930s, the U.S. federal government began to erect a rather formidable welfare state with a broad range of benefits. And almost all of those benefits accrued almost exclusively to whites. So now, social policy is often defined as policy designed to improve well-being, right? Well, I think that's wrong. For while some government programs improve well-being, like some of the ones that we've just listed, others do not. Think about mass incarceration policies, for example, or the welfare reform policies of the 1990s that further impoverished women with children. It's better, I think, to define social policies not by their intent, but by their effect on well-being, and that's for good or ill. So, as a consequence of that, I think it might be useful not only to talk about the social welfare state, things that government does to improve well-being, but the social ill-fare state, things that government does that negatively affect well-being. So, with that in mind, let's now think about the African American experience over the course of our history and those government programs or institutions that have most affected their well-being. Now, the first, of course, is slavery itself, right? And this was, after all, the most important government institution in the lives of African Americans for some 250 years, controlling every aspect of their lives and intimately connected to their well-being, to their welfare. Controlled their ability to work and for what wage, and that is none. What they could eat, how much and when, their access to shelter, their ability to marry, to reproduce, to form families, their access to health care or to education. Now, while slavery formally ended with the Civil War, convict leasing then put in place a new system for extracting labor. And maybe half of all African American men in the South were at one time ensnared by this new system. The much broader array of institutions put in place after the Civil War by state and local governments to regulate and control the labor of blacks in the South is known as Jim Crow. This was about maintaining white political and economic power, and it was held together by an ideology of white supremacy. When those Jim Crow laws failed to keep blacks from voting, from working, from traveling freely, terror was the backup tool, lynchings most infamously. The formal legal architecture of Jim Crow was in place until the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That is to say, the United States was formally an apartheid state until 1965. That's the year I was born. So this is not ancient history. Now, government affected the lives of African Americans through other policies too, and while it was helping white Americans get a college education, secure health care, and buy a home through the GI Bill, it was systematically denying blacks access to the same opportunities and using housing policy to segregate them off into what for centuries we've called ghettos. This is a map that shows the effects of redlining, and that's the intentional segregation of whites and blacks and the denial of mortgages to black families that was a common feature of northern cities in the post-war period. Sociologist Louis Vacan says that ghettos have functioned as, quote, containers for social refuse. That is, they are places to put populations for which there is not enough work, but also not enough political will to care for them. When those containers failed, most notably in the riots of the late 1960s in places like Detroit and Watts, mass imprisonment followed, concentrating its effects on men of color. Here's just how much African American men, African Americans in general, obviously, but African American men in particular, are overrepresented in that system. Adam Gopnik has described the system in this way. Mass incarceration on a scale almost unexampled in human history is a fundamental fact of our country today. Perhaps the fundamental fact, as slavery was the fundamental fact of 1850. In truth, there are more black men in the grip of the criminal justice system, in prison, on probation, or on parole, than were in slavery then. Overall, there are now more people under correctional supervision in America, more than 6 million, than were in the Gulag archipelago under Stalin at its height. Once again, notice how unusual this is. We incarcerate far more people than any other nation on earth. And more of them are young men with devastating consequences. This is just a glimpse at which institutions are doing most of that work. So, throughout our history, there have been two separate welfare states. The white welfare state we are familiar with. That offered programs of indoor relief, of outdoor relief, social assistance, and social assurance to whites in the North, which helped them survive and thrive, and that's all to the good. This is what those other nations of Western Europe and the Nordic countries have been doing to help them create such high levels of well-being. But at the same time in the United States was the oppressive face of the welfare state at work, which actively and intentionally harmed African Americans. The argument is simply that the accumulated effects of these two separate welfare systems surely must matter. Let's take one very crude measure here. On the left, we see a map of just the Confederacy. This is a map used by Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, and it shows the density of slave populations. On the right, approximately the same region is boxed off, Now showing poverty rates for 2013. You notice a pattern? You think it's just a funny coincidence? Notice also this pattern. Simply because slavery faded as a formal institution of control doesn't mean that other institutions didn't step in to fulfill similar functions to control the same populations. This is another consequence. Again, is it a coincidence that the Republican South so fervently stands in the way of U.S. welfare state expansion? All of this history, a constant pattern with variation over time, is essential if we want to make sense of the divergent outcomes that we see in the United States